The first time Rose Harrison saw him through the haze of cigar smoke and dim lantern light, she knew nothing would ever be the same again. It had been 3 years since she'd buried her husband beneath the unforgiving Wyoming soil, 3 years since she'd stopped living and started merely existing. But when that tall stranger with eyes the color of a storm-laden sky extended his hand to her across the crowded saloon, something long dormant fluttered within her chest. It was 1879 in Whispering Pines, a small but growing settlement nestled in Wyoming territory. The town had sprung up around a silver mine and a cattle trail, bringing with it the usual assortment of hopefuls, desperados, and those simply seeking a fresh start. Rose was 26, though the hard years of frontier life had etched fine lines around her eyes that made her appear older. She had come west with her husband Thomas 5 years earlier, full of dreams and ambition. They'd established a small ranch just outside town, but pneumonia had claimed him during a particularly harsh winter, leaving her alone with a struggling property and mounting debts. She'd managed to keep the ranch afloat, barely, by selling off parcels of land and working herself to exhaustion. The townspeople respected her resilience, but regarded her with that particular mix of pity and caution reserved for young widows. She was neither fish nor fowl in their eyes, no longer properly married, yet not available in the way unmarried women were. Rose hadn't attended a social gathering since Thomas's funeral, but tonight was different. Martha Wilson, the wife of the general store owner and one of the few people Rose considered a friend, had practically dragged her to the founder's day dance. "You can't hide away forever," Martha had insisted. Thomas wouldn't have wanted that. So here she was, pressed against the wall in her best dress, a simple navy blue affair that had been fashionable 3 years ago, watching couples twirl across the floor of the converted warehouse. The music from the small band of local musicians swelled and dipped, a lively tune that made even the most reluctant feet tap in rhythm. Rose watched it all from the shadows, content to be invisible, until he walked in. Marshal Zane stepped into the warehouse like he owned it, though nobody in town had ever seen him before. His black Stetson was pushed back on his head, revealing thick dark hair with just a touch of silver at the temples. His face was tanned and weathered from years under the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he'd seen both joy and sorrow in his 30-some years. He wore a dark blue shirt under a leather vest, both of which had seen better days but were clean and well kept. His gun belt sat low on his hips, the worn handle of his Colt suggesting it was more than mere decoration. As he surveyed the room, his gaze passed over Rose, then returned, lingering. She felt a flush creep up her neck and looked away quickly, busying herself with straightening her already straight gloves. "Haven't seen you smile in a long while," Martha said, appearing at Rose's side with 2 cups of punch. "And you haven't even had any whiskey-laced punch yet." "I wasn't smiling," Rose protested, accepting the cup. "If you say so." Martha's eyes twinkled knowingly. "I see our new marshal has caught your attention." "Marshal," Rose couldn't help glancing back toward him, "arrived yesterday. Marshal Zane," Martha chuckled. Parents must have had a sense of humor. Mayor Johnson hired him after what happened to poor Sheriff Collins. Rose nodded, remembering how the elderly sheriff had been gunned down 2 months prior by cattle rustlers. The town had been without law enforcement since then, relying on a committee of businessmen to maintain order. "He comes highly recommended from Colorado territory," Martha continued. "Supposedly cleaned up a town twice as rough as ours." The band struck up a new tune, slower and more melodic than the previous. Couples moved closer together on the dance floor. "He's coming this way," Martha whispered, then disappeared with impressive speed for a woman of her substantial girth. Rose's heart hammered against her ribs as Marshal Zane approached. Up close, she could see the tiny scar that bisected his right eyebrow, and the way his eyes weren't simply blue but a complex mixture of blue and gray, like the sky before a storm. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I couldn't help but notice you haven't danced yet." Rose gripped her punch cup tighter. "I don't dance anymore, Marshal," one corner of his mouth lifted. "You know who I am. Small town," she explained. "News travels fast." "And your name?" he asked. Rose Harrison. Recognition flickered in his eyes. The widow with the ranch on the North Creek. Now it was her turn to be surprised. You've been busy learning about the town. It's my job to know the people I'm protecting. He extended his hand. One dance, Mrs. Harrison, then I'll leave you to your shadows if that's what you prefer. Rose stared at his outstretched hand. It was calloused and strong with a thin white scar across the knuckles. A working hand, not unlike Thomas's had been. The thought brought a familiar pang of grief, but somehow less sharp than before. I haven't danced since my husband died, she said softly. Then it's been too long, he replied, his voice equally soft but with an underlying firmness that brooked no argument. Before she could reconsider, Rose placed her hand in his. He led her onto the dance floor just as the band began a waltz. His hand at her waist was respectful, maintaining a proper distance between them, but she could feel its warmth through the fabric of her dress. I apologize if I'm a bit rusty, she said as they began to move. You're doing fine, he assured her, and she was. Her body remembered the steps even if her mind had forgotten the joy of it. As they circled the floor, Rose became aware of the stares and whispers. The widow Harrison dancing with the new marshal. It would be all over town by morning. People are watching, she murmured. Let them, he replied, guiding her through a turn. I'm not concerned with what others think, Mrs. Harrison. Life's too short for that. Call me Rose, she said, surprising herself. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. Rose, it suits you. When the music ended, he didn't immediately release her hand. Thank you for the dance, Rose. Thank you for asking, Marshal. Marshal, he corrected. If I'm to call you Rose, she nodded, suddenly shy. Marshal. He walked her back to her spot along the wall, but before he could speak again, Mayor Johnson approached, clapping him on the shoulder. Marshal, I need to introduce you to some of our town council members. Marshal gave Rose an apologetic look. Duty calls, but I hope we might continue our conversation another time. Perhaps, she replied non-committally, though her heart raced at the prospect. As he walked away with the mayor, Martha reappeared at Rose's side. Well, 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 she said, fanning herself dramatically. That was quite a sight. Rose took a sip of her punch to hide her smile. It was just a dance, Martha. Honey, the way that man looked at you, it was a lot more than just a dance. Martha squeezed her arm. And it's about time you rejoined the land of the living. Rose watched Marshal across the room, his tall figure easy to spot among the townspeople. For the first time in 3 years, she wondered if Martha might be right. The next morning, Rose was up before dawn as usual. The ranch wouldn't run itself, though it was a far cry from what it had once been. She'd sold off most of the cattle after Thomas died, keeping just enough to maintain a small income. The majority of her earnings now came from the vegetable garden she'd expanded and the eggs from her chickens, which she sold to the hotel and restaurants in town. She was gathering eggs when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Straightening, she brushed loose strands of auburn hair from her face and squinted at the rider coming up the dirt path to her cabin. Even at a distance, she recognized Marshal Zane's broad-shouldered silhouette. Her pulse quickened as he drew closer, and she smoothed her apron over her simple work dress, suddenly conscious of her appearance. He dismounted with easy grace, tying his horse a handsome chestnut gelding to the hitching post. Morning, Rose, he called, removing his hat as he approached. Marshal, she acknowledged, trying to sound casual. What brings you all the way out here, making my rounds, getting to know the area? He glanced around at the small but tidy homestead. Thought I'd check in on you. Check in on me, she repeated, setting down her basket of eggs. I wasn't aware I needed checking on. A smile played at his lips. Consider it professional courtesy. The sheriff's job is to know his town and its people. Well, as you can see, everything is fine here. He nodded, but his eyes were scanning the property with a lawman's attention to detail. You manage all this alone. I hire the Peterson boy to help with the heavier work now and then, but mostly, yes. She couldn't keep the pride from her voice. Impressive, he said, and she could tell he meant it. Most women would have sold up and moved back east. I'm not most women, Marshal. So I'm gathering. He looked at her with a directness that made her skin warm. And I thought we agreed on Marshal. She relented with a small smile. Marshal, then. An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the clucking of chickens and the distant lowing of cattle. "Would you like some coffee?" she offered finally. "It's fresh made." "I'd like that very much." She led him to the small porch where a bench and 2 chairs faced the rolling pastureland. "Have a seat, I'll be right back." In the kitchen, Rose took a moment to compose herself, pressing her cool hands to her flushed cheeks. What was it about this man that unsettled her so? She'd met plenty of handsome men since Thomas's death and had remained utterly unmoved. She returned with 2 steaming cups of coffee and handed one to Marshall, who had settled in one of the chairs. She took the other, leaving a respectable distance between them. "Sugar?" she asked belatedly. He shook his head. "Black is fine, developed the taste in the army. You were a soldier." "Cavalry, served for 8 years after the war." He took a sip of the coffee and nodded appreciatively. "This is good. Thank you." She hesitated, then asked, "How did you become a marshal?" Was deputized in a small town in Colorado when they were shorthanded. Found I had a knack for it. He gazed out at the landscape. "Been wearing a badge for almost 10 years now. And what brought you to Whispering Pines? It's hardly a bustling metropolis." He turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "Wanted somewhere quieter, less shooting, more community." "You might be disappointed then," Rose said wryly. "We've had our share of trouble, so I've heard. Rustlers, mining disputes, the usual frontier problems." He set his cup down. "Nothing I haven't dealt with before." They talked as the sun climbed higher in the sky, about the town, its people, the challenges of ranching in Wyoming territory. Rose found herself enjoying his company more than she'd enjoyed anyone's in years. He was intelligent, observant, and possessed a dry wit that often caught her by surprise. When he finally stood to leave, nearly 2 hours had passed. "I've taken up too much of your morning," he said apologetically. "Not at all," she assured him, surprised to find she meant it. "It was nice to have the company." As he untied his horse, he turned back to her. "There's a town meeting at the church tomorrow evening. Will you be there?" "I hadn't planned on it." "You should come. It concerns everyone, especially those on outlying properties." His expression grew serious. "There have been reports of organized rustling operations moving into the territory." Rose frowned. "I don't have enough cattle to tempt rustlers." "Maybe not, but you're a woman living alone on the outskirts of town. I'd feel better knowing you're informed about any potential dangers." She bristled slightly at the implication she needed looking after, but nodded. "I'll try to make it." He mounted his horse with fluid ease. "I'll save you a seat," he said, settling his hat back on his head. As he rode away, Rose watched until he disappeared over the rise. Only then did she realize she was smiling. The town meeting was held in the small white church that served as Whispering Pines' primary gathering place. By the time Rose arrived, having spent extra time pinning her hair and choosing a dress that wasn't strictly for work, the building was nearly full. She hesitated in the doorway, scanning the crowd. Many turned to look at her. It was unusual for the widow Harrison to attend social functions, but she ignored them, searching for a particular face. Marshall spotted her first. He raised a hand in greeting and gestured to an empty space on the bench beside him. Rose made her way through the crowded room, nodding politely to acquaintances but not stopping to chat. "You came," he said as she sat down, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "You made it sound important," she replied, smoothing her skirt. "It is." His shoulder brushed against hers as he shifted to make more room, and she felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. Mayor Johnson called the meeting to order, and Marshall stood to address the gathered townspeople. Rose watched him transform from the man who had shared coffee on her porch to a figure of authority. His voice carried clearly through the church as he explained the threat of organized cattle rustling operations moving north from Colorado. "These aren't opportunistic thieves taking a cow or two," he warned. "They're well-organized gangs that can clean out a herd in a single night. They're armed and dangerous, and they don't hesitate to eliminate witnesses." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. "What are you going to do about it, Marshal?" called William Foster, one of the largest cattle ranchers in the area. "I'm organizing regular patrols," Marshall replied, "but I'll need volunteers to help cover the territory." I'm also asking everyone to report any strangers or suspicious activity immediately. The meeting continued with discussions of patrol schedules and warning systems. Rose listened attentively, impressed by Marshall's efficiency and clear thinking. When the formal part of the meeting concluded, people broke into smaller groups, continuing to talk about the rustling threat. Marshall turned to Rose. "What did you think?" "I think you've got your work cut out for you," she said honestly. "That's a lot of territory to cover with limited manpower." He nodded, looking grim. "I know, but it's a start." Martha Wilson bustled over, her husband George in tow. "Rose, twice in 1 week we're being positively social, aren't we?" She winked at Marshall. "Though I can guess the reason." Rose felt her cheeks warm. The marshal made a compelling case for attending. "I'm sure he did," Martha said with barely suppressed glee. "George, didn't I say?" Martha, her husband, interrupted with fond exasperation. "Perhaps we should let the marshal and Mrs. Harrison discuss security concerns without our input." Martha looked like she might protest, but then sighed dramatically. "Fine, fine. But Rose, you must come for tea this week. We have so much to catch up on." The emphasis she placed on the last words made their meaning clear. After the Wilsons departed, Rose shook her head. "I apologize for Martha." "She's enthusiastic," Marshall chuckled. "No need to apologize, it's clear she cares about you." "She does," Rose admitted. "She's been a good friend, especially after Thomas died." A brief silence fell at the mention of her husband. Marshall broke it gently. "Would you allow me to escort you home? It's getting dark." Rose hesitated. The proper thing would be to decline. A widow riding alone with a man would certainly set tongues wagging, but the thought of his company for the ride home was too tempting to resist. "That would be very kind, thank you." They left the church together, drawing curious glances that Rose pretended not to notice. Marshall helped her onto her mare before mounting his own horse, and they set off at an easy pace toward her ranch. The spring evening was mild, with a 3/4 moon providing ample light for their journey. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a night bird. "Tell me about your husband," Marshall said eventually. The request surprised her. Most people avoided mentioning Thomas as if speaking his name might somehow wound her further. "Thomas was dedicated," she said after a moment's thought, "to the land, to our future here. He worked from sunrise to sunset building our ranch. Sounds like a good man." "He was," she smiled softly at the memories. "Stubborn as a mule, though. Once he set his mind to something, wild horses couldn't drag him from it." "Is that how you ended up in Wyoming? His determination?" "Partly. I was eager for adventure too. We were childhood sweethearts back in Missouri, grew up on neighboring farms. When he proposed heading west to claim land under the Homestead Act, I was just as excited as he was." They rounded a bend in the road, and Rose's small cabin came into view, a lantern she'd left burning casting a welcoming glow through the window. "Do you regret it?" Marshall asked. "Coming west?" Rose considered the question seriously. "No," she said finally. "Even with everything that's happened, no. This is my home now." They reached her property, and Marshall dismounted to help her down from her horse. His hands at her waist were strong and sure, and when her feet touched the ground, he didn't immediately step back. They stood close enough that she could smell the clean scent of soap and leather that clung to him. "Thank you for the escort," she said, her voice not quite steady. "My pleasure." His eyes searched hers in the moonlight. "Rose," the sound of a branch snapping in the nearby trees interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Marshall's hand moved instantly to his gun as he stepped in front of her. "Get inside," he said quietly, all warmth gone from his voice, replaced by professional alertness. "What is it?" She whispered, "Probably nothing, but please go inside and lock the door." Rose hesitated, then nodded and moved swiftly to the cabin. From the doorway, she watched as Marshall approached the tree line cautiously, his gun drawn. After a tense minute, a jackrabbit bounded out of the brush and disappeared into the night. Marshall holstered his weapon and returned to where she stood. "Just local wildlife," he said, but his eyes continued to scan the darkness beyond the yard. "Would you like to come in?" Rose offered, surprising herself. "For coffee or maybe something stronger." He looked tempted but shook his head. "Better not tonight." His expression softened, but I'd like to call on you properly if you'd allow it. Her heart skipped. Call on me, Sunday after church. Perhaps a picnic by the creek if the weather holds. He cleared his throat. That is, if you're not opposed to the idea. Rose knew she should say no. It was too soon, too fast. She barely knew this man, and yet, I'm not opposed, she said softly. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. Sunday then, she nodded, unable to suppress her own smile. Sunday. As he rode away, Rose stood in the doorway, watching until he disappeared into the night. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something that might have been hope unfurling in her chest like a flower reaching for the sun. The days leading up to Sunday passed in a blur of anticipation and second-guessing for Rose. More than once, she nearly rode into town to tell Marshall she'd changed her mind. It felt disloyal somehow, this flutter of excitement at the prospect of spending time with another man. Thomas would want you to be happy, she told herself firmly as she stood before her small mirror on Sunday morning, pinning her hair. He wouldn't expect you to mourn forever. Still, as she fastened her mother's cameo brooch to the collar of her best dress, a deep green that brought out the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. She arrived at the small church just as the service was beginning, slipping into a back pew. Throughout the reverend's sermon, she was acutely aware of Marshall's presence several rows ahead, his broad shoulders and straight posture unmistakable. When the service ended, Rose remained seated as others filed out, suddenly uncertain. What if he'd reconsidered? What if ready for that picnic? She looked up to find Marshall standing beside her pew, hat in hand, his expression hopeful. Rose nodded, her doubts receding at the warmth in his eyes. Yes. They walked together to where their horses were hitched, ignoring the curious glances from departing churchgoers. Marshall helped her mount, then secured a picnic basket which she hadn't noticed before to his saddle. You came prepared, she observed as they rode away from town. Mrs. Wilson helped, he admitted with a slight smile. She was quite insistent about what should be included. Rose laughed, imagining Martha's enthusiastic assistance. I'm sure she was. They rode for about half an hour, following the creek that wound through Rose's property and beyond. Marshall led them to a small clearing where the creek widened into a shallow pool, shaded by cottonwood trees whose new leaves rustled in the gentle breeze. This is lovely, Rose said as he helped her dismount. I didn't realize this spot was here. Found it while patrolling, he explained, retrieving the picnic basket and a blanket from his saddlebag. Thought it might be a nice place for a picnic. He spread the blanket on a patch of grass near the water's edge, and Rose sat down, arranging her skirts around her. Marshall unpacked the basket, revealing cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, and to Rose's amusement a small jar of Martha's famous pickled beets. She said they were your favorite, he explained, noticing her smile. They are, Rose confirmed, touched by the thoughtfulness. Though I'm surprised she remembered. They ate in companionable conversation, talking of small things, the spring weather, the town gossip, books they'd read. Rose found herself relaxing, enjoying his company in a way she hadn't enjoyed anyone's in years. Tell me about your family, she said as they finished the meal. Do you have one waiting somewhere? Marshall shook his head. No wife, no children. My parents passed years ago and my only brother died at Gettysburg. I'm sorry, she said softly. He shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it hurt less. He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing something new. No, it doesn't. They sat in silence for a moment, the shared understanding of loss creating a bridge between them. My parents are still in Missouri, Rose offered. I write to them regularly, but they've never visited. My mother doesn't approve of the frontier. And what about you? He asked. Do you approve of the frontier? She considered the question. I approve of the freedom it offers, the chance to build something of your own, though I will admit there are days when I miss the comforts of civilization. Like what? Bookshops, she said immediately, and theaters. Proper tea rooms, streets that don't turn to mud with every rain, he chuckled. Fair enough, though I can't say I miss much about city living, too many people, too many rules. Is that why you became a lawman, because you don't like rules? She teased. I like justice, he corrected. Which isn't always the same thing as rules, Rose nodded, understanding the distinction. And have you found it, Justice? Sometimes, he said, his expression growing distant, enough to keep trying. She wanted to ask more, to understand what drove this man who seemed so solid yet carried mysteries in his eyes. But before she could, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted the moment. Marshall glanced at the sky, where dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Looks like we might get caught in a spring storm. They packed up quickly, and Marshall helped Rose back onto her horse just as the first fat raindrops began to fall. Your place is closer, he said. We should head there. By the time they reached Rose's cabin, the rain was coming down in sheets, and they were both soaked through. They stabled the horses quickly, then made a dash for the house. Inside, Rose lit lamps while Marshall stood dripping on the small rug by the door. I have some of Thomas's old clothes, she offered. They might be a bit small, but they're dry. He nodded gratefully. Thank you. She found an old shirt and trousers in the trunk where she kept Thomas's things, then showed Marshall to the small bedroom off the main room that she used for storage. You can change in here, she said, handing him the clothes and a towel. I'll stoke the fire. While he changed, Rose went behind the painted screen in her bedroom to put on a dry dress. She toweled her hair as best she could, then pinned it up loosely, aware that it would dry in unruly waves no matter what she did. When she emerged, Marshall was standing by the fireplace, the flames casting a warm glow on his features. Thomas's shirt strained slightly across his broader shoulders, and the trousers ended a bit above his ankles, but he looked comfortable enough. Better, she asked. He turned, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Much. The storm raged outside, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the plains. Inside, the cabin felt snug and intimate, the space between them charged with unspoken possibilities. I should make some coffee, Rose said, needing something to do with her hands. Let me help, Marshall offered, following her to the small kitchen area. They worked side by side, their movements creating a domestic harmony that felt both foreign and familiar to Rose. As she reached for cups on a high shelf, her hand brushed against his, and she felt that now familiar jolt of awareness. When she turned to look at him, he was watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand to brush a damp strand of hair from her cheek. Rose, he said, her name almost a question. She didn't know who moved first, only that suddenly his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing urgency as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and she wound her hands into his shirt, anchoring herself against the flood of sensations. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Marshall rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since the first moment I saw you, he admitted. At the dance, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. You looked so beautiful and so sad. All I wanted was to see you smile. Rose's heart swelled with emotion. You've given me reason to, she said softly. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Rose's small cabin, something new and fragile was taking root, a promise of happiness she had thought forever lost. The weeks that followed were like a dream for Rose. Marshall called on her regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book from the East, wildflowers he'd picked on patrol, once even a bolt of fine blue fabric that matched her eyes exactly. They were discreet, mindful of the town's penchant for gossip, but neither made any secret of their growing attachment. Martha Wilson was beside herself with joy, taking every opportunity to mention what a fine couple they made. You're positively glowing, she told Rose during one of their tea visits. It does my heart good to see it. Rose couldn't deny the change in herself. She laughed more, sang while she worked, found herself looking forward to each day in a way she hadn't since Thomas's death. Marshall, too, seemed to flourish. The townspeople remarked on how the usually serious Marshall had taken to smiling more, how he'd joined in community events, and made himself a part of Whispering Pines in a way no lawman had before. But shadows loomed on the horizon. Reports of cattle rustling continued to come in from neighboring communities, growing closer to Whispering Pines with each incident. I'm concerned, Marshall confessed to Rose one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. The pattern suggests they're working their way toward us. What can be done? She asked, her hand finding his. We've increased patrols, warned the ranchers to be vigilant. He squeezed her fingers. But I won't lie to you, Rose. These men are dangerous. When they do hit, it could get ugly. The worry in his eyes made her heart ache. She had only just found happiness again. The thought of losing him was unbearable. Be careful, she whispered. Please. He drew her into his arms, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Always. 3 nights later, Rose was awakened by the sound of galloping hooves approaching her cabin. She grabbed the shotgun she kept by her bed and moved cautiously to the window. In the moonlight, she recognized Marshal's chestnut gelding. He dismounted quickly and strode to her door, his expression grim. What is it? She asked as she let him in, taking in his dust-covered clothes and weary eyes. Rustlers hit the Foster ranch, he said, accepting the water she offered. Took half his herd and shot 2 of his hands, were forming a posse to go after them. Fear gripped Rose's heart. When? First light. He met her gaze steadily. I wanted to see you before I left. The unspoken words hung between them in case I don't come back. Rose set down the water glass and stepped into his arms, holding him fiercely. You come back to me, Marshal Zane, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. Do you hear me? You come back. He tilted her face up to his eyes full of emotions too complex to name. There's something I need to ask you, he said. Something I've been wanting to ask for weeks. Rose's heart stuttered. Yes. I know it hasn't been long, he began, his voice rough with feeling. But when a man reaches my age, he knows his own mind, and my heart is certain about you, Rose Harrison. He took her hands in his. I love you. I want to build a life with you if you'll have me when I return. He paused, swallowing hard. When I return, will you marry me? Tears sprang to Rose's eyes, joy and fear tangling in her chest. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. The smile that lit his face was worth every moment of grief she had endured, every lonely night, every tear shed. He kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and passion and the future they would build together. All too soon, he had to leave. Rose stood in the doorway, watching him ride away, her heart both fuller and more fearful than it had ever been. The next 3 days were the longest of Rose's life. She went through the motions of her daily tasks, but her mind was with the posse, imagining every possible scenario, most of them ending in tragedy. On the evening of the 3rd day, she was in the garden when she heard horses approaching. Her heart in her throat, she straightened to see a group of riders coming toward the cabin. At their head was Marshal, dusty and unshaven but gloriously, wonderfully alive. She dropped her basket and ran to meet him as he dismounted, throwing herself into his arms with such force that he staggered back a step. You're here, she said, tears streaming down her face. You're safe. I promised I'd come back, he reminded her, holding her close. Over her shoulder, she could see the other riders smiling or looking away discreetly. Did you catch them? She asked when she finally composed herself. Marshal nodded, his expression hardening briefly. We did. They won't be troubling anyone again. She didn't ask for details, understanding from his tone that justice had been swift and final. Good. As the other riders continued toward town, Marshal stayed behind. He looked at Rose as if memorizing her features, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn velvet box. This was my mother's, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. I've carried it with me for years, waiting for the right woman to give it to. Rose's breath caught as he took the ring from its box. It's beautiful. Not as beautiful as you, he said, taking her left hand. Rose Harrison, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she said without hesitation. With all my heart, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Rose felt the last shadows of grief give way to the bright promise of tomorrow. She had hidden in the shadows long enough. It was time to step into the light and into the arms of the man who had helped her find her way back to life. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church of Whispering Pines, with Martha Wilson weeping happily in the front pew and the entire town in attendance. Rose wore a dress of blue silk, made from the fabric Marshal had given her, and carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow where they'd shared their first picnic. As she spoke her vows, Rose thought of Thomas and silently thanked him for the love they had shared. But her heart was full of the present now, and the future stretching before her, a future with the man whose steady gaze promised to love and cherish her for all their days. When Reverend Jenkins pronounced them husband and wife, Marshal drew Rose into his arms for a kiss that sealed their commitment and set the church buzzing with appreciative murmurs. "No more shadows," he whispered against her lips. "Only light," she agreed, her heart so full she thought it might burst. And as they walked out of the church together, into the bright Wyoming sunshine and the cheers of their neighbors, Rose knew that this was more than a second chance at love. It was a new beginning, a fresh chapter in a story still being written, their story, full of promise and possibility, stretching out before them like the vast frontier they both called home.